On 26 August 2014, the report of an investigation into the English town of Rotheram was published. The findings shocked Britain. 400 underage girls were raped in the town by organized migrant gangs between 1997 and 2013. To give you an idea of the scale of the nightmare, I'll tell you that, in percentage terms, almost 10% of all girls in the town aged between 11 and 17 were affected. The vast majority of rapists are ethnic Pakistanis. If all of this were the plot of some scary blackish film, we would not be able to believe that what is happening is real. These details sound too cartoonish, too grotesque, too implausible to be true, but all of it is true. Today, let's talk about this complex issue. The details are truly, not just soul-chilling, but bring you into a kind of stupor. How can this be in the 21st century in a first-world country? Why didn't this get more publicity? Why are the people who covered it up and hushed it up still at large? Why are so many of them still in power? So, we'll start going over the details of how the scumbags chose their victims. Children were targeted because they had white skin color and were Christians. This is the direct speech of the rapists, given by the victims and voiced during the interrogation. I will elaborate on this in more detail later. The victims tried to contact the police, but time after time the police ignored their reports or refused to prosecute. Somehow the rapists got wind of the complaints, and as a result, the poor children were threatened and beaten. The parents of the victims who dared to go to the police also suffered. The whole system of state authority in Rotheram worked to cover up a huge pedophile criminal network. It is difficult to describe the horror experienced by the young victims. They were raped in groups, taken to other towns in northern England, kidnapped and intimidated. There were cases where children were doused with petrol and threatened with being set on fire. Several victims had a gun held to their heads and were demonstratively cocked. Scumbags forced girls to watch brutal rapes and threatened that the victims would be next if they told anyone. Some victims had their homes set on fire after going to the police. Girls raped by Pakistani gangs gave birth to more than 100 babies. Many have also suffered multiple miscarriages and abortions. Girls as young as 11 years old were abused by multiple male perpetrators. This is a quote from a report compiled by Professor Alexis J., the main document of the Rotheram scandal. We have scrutinized it to give a detailed account of the case. Why? Well, the corrupt city authorities were afraid of appearing racist towards Muslims. And, of course, there were threats from the criminals themselves. Pakistani gangs have held the entire city in fear for decades. And these are not just allegations. Rotheram City Council has ignored appeals from raped children and their parents since 2001, fearing attention and accusations of racism. Council staff have also actively obstructed investigations by other agencies. A Home Office official who investigated child rapes in Rotheram in 2002 accused the council of being involved in the unauthorized removal of information from her office. This came after she sent her report to the city council. Yes, you heard right. Someone from the city council broke into the detective's office and erased data from the investigation. What caused this nightmare? Why did the British authorities allow ethnic criminals to rape 1,500 schoolgirls? And what does Keith Starmer, the current British Prime Minister, have to do with this? Rotheram is a medium-sized town in South Yorkshire, the Old English countryside. Its population is only 100,000. The municipality of Rotheram, which includes neighbouring towns and countryside, has just 150,000 people. And only 4% of them are Pakistani, and so such a minority has been able to create a criminal gang that has kept English schoolgirls in fear for decades. Not just a gang, but a vast criminal network of social connections that entangled the entire city. So how did the criminals choose their most vulnerable victims? The girls who were victimized by the Pakistanis were usually, but not always, from dysfunctional families. In 46% of cases, Their families had a history of domestic violence, and in 63% of cases, they had a history of frequent truancy from school. 1 in 3 victims were in the custody of juvenile services. And mind you, all those child welfare services didn't save them. Because of this, the police often looked at the violence as a social squabble. Children from dysfunctional families, what can they do? Instead of protecting children at risk, the police left them to face organized crime alone. At the same time, children from perfectly normal families also fell into the net of the molesters. The vast majority of the victims were white ethnic English women. These crimes in general look like a caricature drawn by a very radical opponent of migration. Little white girls are raped in groups by Pakistani Muslims. Sounds like a racist myth? You do agree, but it's fucking true. Pakistanis have terrorized entire families, waiting in cars at the door of their homes to intimidate them, smashing windows, threatening them over the phone. One of the raped girls was ready to give a statement to the police, but suddenly received a text message that her younger sister had fallen into the hands of the rapists. She was told that what would happen to her next, she should decide for herself, so she withdrew her statement. In at least 2 cases, the girls' fathers managed to find their daughters. They tried to take them home from the rapists' dens, but when the police arrived on the scene, they arrested the fathers, not the rapists. In some cases, even the girls themselves were arrested. For example, in the late 90s, 2 12-year-old girls, at least one of whom had already come to the attention of the police as a victim of violence, were found drunk in an abandoned house, surrounded by several Pakistani adults. None of the adults were of interest to the valiant police, but one of the girls was arrested for drinking alcoholic beverages. As a rule, the girls were promoted according to the following scheme. First, a young Pakistani guy would approach 6 or 7 schoolgirls, pay attention to them, give them gifts, and drive them around in cars. This made a big impression on girls from disadvantaged families. After all, young men 10 years older became their boyfriends, and then introduced them to their mates. And that's when alcohol and sometimes drugs came into play. And, of course, threats and direct violence. This business was put on the stream. One and the same boyfriend could simultaneously work several schoolgirls at the same time. Pakistanis literally built a conveyor belt in Rotheram. This conveyor belt involved ethnic Pakistani businesses, including taxis. Local girls learnt long ago that it is simply dangerous to ride alone in a taxi. The driver is likely to molest. In addition, molesters often use taxis to pick up victims directly from school. In a significant proportion of the cases that reached the police, it was in the taxis of Pakistani taxi drivers that the victim first met the rapist. At the same time, the police and social services systematically refused to consider cases, claiming that the girls were simply voluntarily entering into relationships, ignoring alcohol and drugs and the fact that they were children of 1,214 years of age. There were also cases of pregnancies, miscarriages, and abortions. Some of the girls are still raising children born to Pakistani rapists. Over the years, inspections and auditors have praised the work of local child protection officials. There were only occasional comments that improvements were needed in some places. Minor flaws on the ground. Of course, there is a great deal of trivial negligence in ignoring the problem. There are aspects of class neglect of dysfunctional families, but the main reason, police officers and politicians preferred not to talk about Pakistani gangs to avoid accusations of racism, and when it came to the actual proceedings, they pretended that these were just isolated incidents. Crimes happen, and sometimes the perpetrator is Pakistani. It happens, come in, there's nothing to see here, but in reality, we were talking about a huge network of organized ethnic crime. For 18 years, from 1994 to 2012, Rotherham was represented in the British Parliament by Labour Member of Parliament Dennis McShane. During that time, he never once raised the issue of a gang of rapists, despite rumours and even appeals from the parents of the abused girls. Why did neither he nor his fellow politicians at local level do anything about it? McShane has an answer. No one wanted to rock the boat of the multicultural community. Simply stunning. In the early 10th, the veil of silence was broken by journalists. The Times ran a series of stories about the silence on the Pakistani gang problem. After this, attention to the situation increased and serious scrutiny began, which eventually led to the publication of the J report. It was then that the public first learned of the figure of 1,400 victims. This became the tipping point. Rotheram became a national scandal. The police filled the city, the perpetrators lost their cloak of obscurity, and by 2015, mass rapes in the city finally came to end. This monstrous story happened 10 years ago. Why are we bringing it up again? The old case has started to be talked about again thanks to Ilon Musk. The billionaire commented on the arrest of politician Tommy Robins, who released a documentary about the Rotheram nightmare. Mind you, Tommy Robins has been in an English maximum security prison for almost a year for releasing a non-politically correct film. Ilon has also endorsed the right-wing anti-migrant Reform Party. It is led by Nigel Farage, a veteran of English right-wing politics. Musk recalled the Rotheram scandal and accused the left-wing government and Britain's liberal media of glossing over the crimes of ethnic minorities. He also blamed Prime Minister Keir Starmer personally. Starmer, after all, was Britain's Attorney General from 2008 to 2013. The Attorney General's office under his administration far from adequately investigated cases from Rotheram. Although, of course, it is a stretch to say that Starmer personally covered up for the Pakistanis. The liberal media criticized Musk for pretending to be outraged by pedophiles, but in fact this is just an excuse to interfere in British politics. I mean, the scandal is over 10 years old, and you know, they'd be right if all the perpetrators had got what they deserved in that time. But they haven't. 10 years after Jay's report was published, about 60 rapists have gone to prison, with 1,500 underage victims over nearly 15 years. So clearly not everyone has been punished, but not a single person from the local authorities and local police has been brought to justice, even though they have turned a blind eye to the inferno for decades. Not a single criminal case of negligence has been opened. But for some reason the liberal media is not interested in the idiotic statements of some celebrities who literally blame the victims themselves for the rapes. For example, singer Lily Allen, she said the victims would have been raped by someone at some point in their lives anyway. Which means the problem wasn't the Pakistani rapists who were after them. Do you hear that? Yes, really makes the blood run cold in my veins. Lily Allen is generally a talented performer, but she is so disconnected from the grief of the people who live in the same country as her, so indifferent to the fate of children victimized by gangs of Pakistani rapists, that she is capable of issuing statements like this. Well, I don't know, what is it? Psychopathy? Cynicism? Obsession with some liberal doctrine of her own? I can picture her looking at a raped child and saying, "The problem is not the rapists," because she would have been raped anyway. She says this at a time when it is revealed that there have been gangs of Pakistanis operating throughout the United Kingdom who have been systematically, for decades, raping children in small towns. But the idiots don't end with Lily. Historian and author Tom Holland called police inaction against Muslim pedophile gangs a noble act that prevented adding fuel to the fire of racism. He said this while commenting on a similar offence in the town of Rochdale. But the British public is largely sane and asking for answers. 76% of Britons support a major new inquiry into all episodes of child abuse. On 8 January this year, the British Parliament voted on a right-wing motion to launch a new national inquiry, but the left-wing majority voted against it. Of course, Elon Musk and the British right are linking Keir Starmer and the British left to the Rotheram scandal because it benefits them politically. But that doesn't mean they're wrong. Rotheram is a stain on the British left. At the time Jay's report was published, 49 of the 63 MPs on the local council were Labour Party members. It was under a left-wing supermajority that all crimes took place and went unpunished. In the next local elections after the scandal, the British anti-migrant nationalists of the Independence Party managed to take almost 30% of the vote. This was a record result for the party, but the majority still remained with Labour, and the nationalists couldn't hold on to the result because the party broke up at the federal level after Brexit, and this means that Rotheram still has no authorities who are ready to speak openly about the main cause of the tragedy: uncontrolled migration and silence of problems in interethnic relations. In general, the Pakistani diaspora in the United Kingdom emerged after the collapse of the British Empire, the partition of British India, and the creation of independent Pakistan. Since Pakistanis were former British subjects, migration to the United Kingdom was simplified for them. By the 70s, there were about 100,000 Pakistanis living in the country. Today, there are more than 1.5 million of them. Before the eyes of the native British, the Pakistani community has grown 15 times in 50 years. And the problem here is not their nationality, the color of their skin, or the cut of their eyes. The problem is a culture that combines several features. Firstly, a woman in this culture is perceived not as a human being, but as a man's property. And an underage girl, even more so in Western European culture, this perception is long past. Secondly, it is a clan culture where everyone is connected to everyone else by hundreds of informal ties. Among British Pakistanis, this problem is compounded by the fact that everyone is literally related to each other. People marry within the clan. Almost half of newborn ethnic Pakistani babies in Britain are born to parents who are cousins or second cousins to each other. Finally, the Pakistani community of Rotheram was not made up of educated secular Pakistanis who were successful in British society. It was the poor strata that became the soil for the germination of mafia structures and organized crime, and the policy of mass importation of foreigners into low-skilled positions covered the whole of England with a thick layer of this soil. Just because France or Spain haven't had their Rotheram yet doesn't mean it won't happen. It has already happened in Germany. We all remember what happened in Cologne in 2015. Whole cities are already popping up in Europe where a huge proportion of the population is made up of migrants. Here's a look at the same missile. This lesson from England allows us not only to remember what can happen because of widespread political correctness, but also to try to finally learn something from other people's mistakes. To prevent a Swedish, Austrian or Italian Rotheram from happening, it is not enough for us to revise migration policy. After all, the Rotheram policemen were not Pakistani, but they still became part of the criminal system. Reforming police structures to make them truly transparent and accountable to the public is also a very important step. The police must work for the people, and for that transparency is essential. Otherwise, as in Rotheram, they will be quietly arresting victims instead of the real criminals. But a rethinking of the approach to migration is also necessary. Clan communities of alien cultures should not be allowed to entangle every corner of the country. See you in the next issue.